In the year 1095, he held the most prestigious teaching position in the Islamic world. Thousands attended his lectures in Baghdad, the intellectual capital of a civilization that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. He had written books that scholars debated across an empire. Rulers sought his counsel. Religious authorities deferred to his judgments. He was 40 years old at the absolute height of his powers, and the words would not come. When Al-Ghazali stood before his students, his tongue failed him. The lectures he had delivered with such ease, the arguments that had flowed from him like water from a spring, simply stopped. When he tried to eat, his stomach refused the food. For 6 months he struggled, forcing himself to teach, pushing through the lectures, but his voice grew weaker and his body grew thinner. The doctors examined him and found nothing physically wrong. The sickness was not in his body, it was in his soul. He had built his life on knowledge. From his earliest years as an orphan in the Persian city of Tus, he had devoted himself to learning. He had studied under the greatest teachers of his age. He had mastered Islamic law in all its complexity, Islamic theology in all its subtlety, and the philosophical tradition that stretched back through Arabic translations to ancient Greece. He could argue any position and defeat any opponent. His intellect was legendary. His reputation was unmatched. And now a terrible question consumed him. Did he actually know anything at all? Or had he spent his life repeating arguments he had memorized, defending positions because defending them brought him fame, accumulating knowledge that never touched his heart? He could prove the existence of God through rational demonstration. He could explain the attributes of the divine with philosophical precision. But did he know God? Did he experience the reality of what he described, or was he merely arranging words in sophisticated patterns? The crisis that gripped Al-Ghazali was not a loss of faith in the ordinary sense. He did not doubt that God existed or that the prophet had spoken truly. What he doubted was whether he himself had ever moved beyond the surface of these truths. He had taught others about certainty without possessing it. He had explained the path to God without walking it. He had described the transformation of the heart without undergoing it. And his body, wiser than his mind, had finally rebelled. What makes this crisis so remarkable is that it occurred at the moment of his greatest success. Al-Ghazali was not a failed scholar seeking consolation in mysticism. He was not a young man wrestling with doubts before he had established himself. He was the most accomplished intellectual of his generation, holding the most honored position his civilization could offer, and he had discovered that none of it satisfied him. The achievement that others envied had revealed itself as hollow. The position he held was at the Nizamiya College in Baghdad, an institution founded by the powerful vizier Nizam al-Mulk to train scholars in Islamic law and theology. To be appointed to the Baghdad, Nizamiya was to reach the summit of the academic world. The salary was generous. The prestige was immense. Students travelled from across the empire to study under whoever held this chair. And Al-Ghazali had held it for 4 years, lecturing to audiences that numbered in the hundreds, writing works that established his reputation as the defender of orthodox belief against the encroachments of the philosophers. Yet the very brilliance of his performance concealed a growing emptiness. He later wrote that he examined his situation and found that he was immersed in attachments that surrounded him on every side. He examined his actions, and the finest of them were his teaching and instruction. Yet he saw that he was dealing with sciences that were unimportant and useless for the journey to the next world. He reflected on the purpose of his teaching and saw that it was not sincere for the sake of God. Rather, its motive was the pursuit of fame and reputation. This is a confession of extraordinary honesty. Most scholars, achieving what Al-Ghazali had achieved, would have found ways to justify their position. They would have told themselves that their work served God by defending true doctrine, that their fame was simply the natural result of their excellence, that their wealth allowed them to support worthy causes. Al-Ghazali could not maintain these comfortable fictions. The light of self-examination revealed that his motives were mixed at best and corrupt at worst. He taught not because students needed what he had to offer, but because teaching made him famous. He argued not because truth demanded defense, but because victory in argument fed his pride. The physical symptoms that followed this realization were not, in his understanding, merely psychosomatic responses to stress. They were the rebellion of his body against the lie his life had become. He could not speak because he had nothing true to say. He could not eat because he was trying to nourish a self that needed to die. The doctors could find nothing wrong because there was nothing wrong with his body. The sickness was the soul's recognition that it was living a false life, and the soul was using the only language the body could hear. For 6 months he struggled with what to do. The choice before him seemed impossible. On one side stood his duty to his family, his students, his position, and all the people who depended on him. On the other side stood the call to abandon everything, to strip away the accumulated weight of his success, and to seek the certainty that argument could never provide. He wavered between these alternatives, one day resolving to leave Baghdad, the next day changing his mind. The conflict paralyzed him, and the paralysis intensified his symptoms. Then something shifted. He later described it as a light that God cast into his heart, not an argument that persuaded him, but an illumination that showed him what he must do. The certainty he had sought through intellectual means came to him by another route entirely. He knew, with a knowledge that bypassed his rational mind, that he had to leave. He had to give up his position, give away his wealth, leave his family, and disappear into the anonymity of a spiritual seeker. So he did what no one expected. He invented a reason for leaving Baghdad, telling people that he was going to Mecca on pilgrimage, and he departed. But he did not go directly to Mecca. Instead, he went to Damascus, where he lived for nearly 2 years in the Great Mosque, spending his days in spiritual retreat, practicing the disciplines of the Sufi mystics, seeking through experience what he could not find through argument. For 11 years he wandered, Damascus, Jerusalem, Hebron, Mecca, and eventually back to his hometown of Tus. He lived simply, owning little, needing less. He practiced the disciplines of the spiritual path, ritual prayer, meditation, remembrance of God, the examination of conscience, the purification of intention. He sought out teachers who could guide him. He read the works of the great mystics who had come before him, and slowly, over years of practice, something began to change. What changed was not his beliefs. He had always believed in God, in the Prophet, in the teachings of Islam. What changed was the quality of his knowing. The doctrines he had defended intellectually became realities he experienced directly. The God he had proven through arguments became a presence he encountered in prayer. The next world he had discussed in theological terms became a destination he could feel himself approaching. Knowledge moved from his head to his heart. When he finally returned to teaching, at the request of the ruler, he was not the same man who had left. The brilliance was still there, the learning undiminished, the capacity for argument as sharp as ever. But now there was something else beneath the surface, a depth of experience that gave weight to his words. He taught not because teaching brought him fame, but because he had something to share. He wrote not to defeat opponents, but to guide seekers. The remaining years of his life produced works that would shape Islamic spirituality for centuries to come. Al-Ghazali matters because he asked a question that every thoughtful person eventually confronts. Is what I claim to know actually true? Can I be certain of anything, and if so, how? His answer changed the history of 2 civilizations. In the Islamic world, his works transformed the relationship between law, theology, and mysticism. integrating the inner path into mainstream religious practice. In the Western world, his critique of philosophical certainty anticipated arguments that would not appear in Europe for another 6 centuries. But before we can understand his answer, we must understand his world. The Islamic civilization into which Al-Ghazali was born was not a peripheral culture on the margins of human achievement. It was the most sophisticated civilization on earth, the heir to Greek philosophy and Persian administration, to Roman engineering and Indian mathematics. Its cities were larger than anything in medieval Europe, its libraries more extensive, its scholars more numerous and more accomplished. To understand Al-Ghazali, we must first understand the world that produced him. This civilization had emerged from what seemed like unpromising beginnings. In the 7th century, the Arabian Peninsula had been a peripheral region, home to nomadic tribes and small trading towns, largely ignored by the great empires of Persia and Byzantium that dominated the surrounding lands. Then came the Prophet Muhammad, and within a single century, his followers had conquered an empire stretching from the Atlantic to Central Asia. The speed of this expansion remains one of history's most remarkable phenomena. But conquest was only the beginning. The Arabs who burst out of the peninsula in the 7th century were relatively few in number, and the lands they conquered were home to ancient and sophisticated civilizations. Persia had been an empire for more than a millennium, with traditions of government, art, and literature that stretched back to antiquity. Egypt had been the seat of civilization for even longer. Syria and Mesopotamia had been centers of culture since the earliest days of human history. The conquering Arabs did not simply replace these civilizations. They absorbed them, creating something new from the fusion of Arab energy, Persian sophistication, Greek philosophy, and the spiritual intensity of Islam. The translation movement that followed the early conquests was one of the great intellectual projects in human history. Beginning in the 8th century and continuing for several hundred years, scholars working in Baghdad and other centers translated the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world into Arabic. The works of Aristotle and Plato, of Euclid and Ptolemy, of Galen and Hippocrates, of Plotinus and the Neoplatonists all became available in Arabic translation. This was not mere preservation. The translators and their successors did not simply copy Greek ideas. They developed them, criticized them, extended them, and synthesized them with insights from other traditions. The result was a philosophical and scientific culture of extraordinary richness. Islamic mathematicians developed algebra, introduced the concept of zero from India, and made advances in geometry and trigonometry that would not be surpassed for centuries. Islamic astronomers refined the calculations of the ancients and created observatories that produced star charts of unprecedented accuracy. Islamic physicians built on the Greek medical tradition and produced encyclopedic works that would be used in European universities for 500 years. Islamic philosophers grappled with the deepest questions about God, the soul, the nature of reality, and the limits of reason. Two figures dominated the philosophical landscape of Al-Ghazali's world, and both would become targets of his critique. Al-Farabi, who died in 950, had been the first great Islamic philosopher to attempt a comprehensive synthesis of Greek thought with Islamic revelation. He had argued that philosophy and prophecy were two paths to the same truth, that the philosopher who follows reason and the prophet who receives revelation arrive at the same understanding by different routes. This was a bold claim, and it shaped the philosophical tradition for generations to come. Even more influential was Avicenna, who died in 1037, just 2 decades before Al-Ghazali's birth. Avicenna was perhaps the most brilliant mind the Islamic world produced. His works on medicine remained authoritative into the modern era. His philosophical system, building on Aristotle but transforming him in fundamental ways, became the framework within which educated Muslims thought about the nature of reality. He argued that the world emanates from God necessarily, that God knows only universals and not particulars, and that the soul survives death but the body does not rise. These positions would become central targets of Al-Ghazali's attack, yet philosophy was only one dimension of the intellectual life of this civilization. Equally important and far more widely practiced was the study of Islamic law. The Prophet had not only preached a message of spiritual transformation, he had established a community and laid down rules for its governance. After his death, his followers worked out the implications of his teachings in ever greater detail, developing systems of law that covered every aspect of life, from ritual prayer to commercial transactions, from marriage and divorce to crime and punishment. By Al-Ghazali's time, this legal tradition had crystallized into several major schools, each with its own methods and conclusions. The Shafi'i school, to which Al-Ghazali belonged, emphasized the role of the prophetic traditions in legal reasoning. The Hanafi school, dominant in the eastern regions of the empire, allowed greater scope for analogical reasoning. The Maliki school, strong in North Africa and Spain, gave special weight to the practice of the early Muslim community in Medina. These were not warring sects, but different approaches to a common task, and scholars could and did move between them. The study of law required the study of the prophetic traditions, the vast collection of reports about what the Prophet said and did. These traditions were the second source of Islamic law after the Quran itself, and verifying their authenticity was a science of extraordinary sophistication. Scholars developed methods for evaluating the chains of transmission by which reports were passed down, assessing the reliability of each transmitter, and judging whether a tradition was sound, acceptable, or fabricated. Al-Ghazali mastered this science as he mastered all the others. Theology, too, had developed into a sophisticated discipline. The early Muslims had confronted difficult questions about God's nature, human freedom, and the relationship between faith and works. Were the attributes of God distinct from his essence or identical with it? Did humans have genuine freedom, or was everything predetermined? Could a grave sinner still be considered a Muslim? Different schools emerged with different answers, and by Al-Ghazali's time the Ash'ari school had become dominant among Sunni Muslims. Al-Ghazali would defend Ash'ari theology against its critics, while also transcending its limitations. But alongside these official disciplines of philosophy, law, and theology, there existed another tradition that would prove decisive for Al-Ghazali's life. This was the mystical tradition known as Sufism. From the earliest days of Islam, some believers had sought not merely to obey God's commands, but to experience his presence directly. They practiced disciplines of prayer and fasting that went beyond what the law required. They sought states of consciousness in which the ordinary sense of self dissolved, and only God remained. They spoke of love for God in language that sometimes alarmed the more legally minded scholars. By Al-Ghazali's time, Sufism had developed its own literature, its own terminology, and its own chains of transmission linking living masters to earlier teachers, all the way back to the Prophet himself. Great Sufis had described the stages of the spiritual path, the obstacles that blocked progress, the states of consciousness that could be achieved, and the ultimate goal of union with the divine. Some of this language made orthodox scholars nervous. Did the Sufis claim to become God? Did they think they could bypass the obligations of the law? Were their practices innovations that corrupted the pure faith? Al-Ghazali would spend 11 years immersed in Sufi practice and would emerge as the great reconciler, showing how the mystical path could be integrated with orthodox belief and legal practice. But that reconciliation lay in the future. First, he had to climb to the top of the academic world, and then he had to fall. The political context of Al-Ghazali's career was the Seljuk Empire, a Turkish dynasty that had burst out of Central Asia in the 11th century and conquered much of the Islamic heartland. The Seljuks were recent converts to Islam, and they brought with them a military vigour that the older Arab and Persian dynasties had lost. They ruled as sultans, nominally subject to the caliph in Baghdad, but in practice holding all real power. The caliph retained religious authority, but exercised little political control. The Seljuks were zealous defenders of Sunni Islam against its Shia rivals. They founded colleges, endowed mosques, and supported scholars who upheld orthodox doctrine. The Nizamiya colleges, named after the great vizier Nizam al-Mulk, who founded them, were instruments of this policy. They trained scholars in Shafi'i law and Ash'ari theology, producing the educated elite who would staff the courts and mosques of the empire. Al-Ghazali's appointment to the Baghdad Nizamiya was not merely an academic honour. It was a position of real influence in the struggle to define what Islam meant and how Muslims should live. The year of Al-Ghazali's crisis, 1095, was also the year that Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. Christian armies would soon march toward Jerusalem, eventually conquering it in 1099 and establishing kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast. This violent intrusion from the west would reshape the political landscape of the region for 2 centuries. Al-Ghazali lived through the beginning of this upheaval, though his writings say little about it. His concerns were internal rather than external. The enemy he fought was not the Christian knight, but the unexamined life, not the foreign invader, but the corrupt heart. Into this world of sophisticated learning and political complexity, Al-Ghazali was born. His path to Baghdad led from the provincial city of Tus, through years of study and struggle, to the position that made him famous. Understanding that journey reveals not just the life of one remarkable individual, but the educational system of an entire civilization. The father died when Al-Ghazali was still young, leaving him and his younger brother Ahmad as orphans. Before his death, he had entrusted his sons and a small sum of money to a Sufi friend, asking him to ensure that the boys received the education their father could not afford to provide. This Sufi guardian honoured his friend's dying wish, using the funds to support the brothers' early studies. When the money ran out, he advised them to enroll in a local school where they could continue their education while receiving the food and support that students customarily received. It was a precarious beginning for a man who would become the most celebrated scholar of his age. The circumstances of Al-Ghazali's childhood shaped his character in ways that would become apparent only later. He knew what it meant to be poor and dependent on others. He understood that learning was not merely an intellectual pursuit, but a path to security and advancement. He experienced the Sufi tradition not as an abstract doctrine, but as the lived reality of his early years, embodied in the guardian who raised him. These experiences would resonate through his later crisis and transformation. The education Al-Ghazali received followed the standard curriculum of Islamic learning. He began with the Quran, memorizing the sacred text and learning to recite it properly. He studied Arabic grammar and literature, the tools necessary for understanding religious texts and participating in scholarly discourse. He learned the basics of Islamic law, the practical knowledge that every educated Muslim needed. And he showed from an early age an exceptional capacity for mastering difficult material and engaging in sophisticated argument. His early studies in Tus were followed by a period in Gurgan, a city to the southeast of the Caspian Sea, where he studied under a scholar named Ahmad al-Radhakani. An anecdote from this period reveals something of Al-Ghazali's character. While travelling from Gurgan back to Tus, his party was attacked by bandits who took everything the travellers possessed. Among the stolen goods were the notebooks in which Al-Ghazali had recorded what he learned from his teacher. He begged the bandit chief to return these notes, saying they were of no value to anyone but himself. the bandit supposedly mocked him, asking what kind of knowledge it was that could be taken away so easily. Al-Ghazali reportedly took this criticism to heart and spent 3 years memorizing everything in his notebooks so that the knowledge could never be stolen from him again. Whether or not this story is historically accurate, it captures something essential about Al-Ghazali's approach to learning. Knowledge, for him, was not merely information stored externally. It had to be internalized, made part of oneself, available for use at any moment. This understanding would later inform his critique of scholars who possessed learning they had not truly absorbed, whose knowledge remained on the surface rather than penetrating to the heart. The decisive step in Al-Ghazali's education came when he travelled to Nishapur, the great intellectual centre of Khorasan, to study under the famous theologian Abu al-Ma'ali al-Juwayni. Al-Juwayni, known by the honorific title Imam of the Two Holy Places, was the most eminent scholar of his generation, an Ash'ari theologian whose works defended orthodox doctrine against its critics. To study under him was to receive the finest education available in the Islamic world. Al-Ghazali remained in Nishapur for approximately 8 years, from his late teens until his late 20s, mastering everything his teacher had to offer. The relationship between Al-Ghazali and Al-Juwayni was complicated. The student clearly surpassed the teacher in intellectual power, and this seems to have created tension. Al-Juwayni is reported to have called Al-Ghazali a deep ocean, acknowledging his brilliance while perhaps resenting it. For his part, Al-Ghazali absorbed his teacher's methods, but would later go far beyond them. The Ash'ari theology Al-Juwayni taught became one tool among many in Al-Ghazali's arsenal, not the final word on theological questions, but a starting point for deeper inquiry. During his years in Nishapur, Al-Ghazali mastered not only theology, but also Islamic law, the prophetic traditions, the interpretation of the Quran, and the philosophical tradition represented by Avicenna and Al-Farabi. His capacity for absorbing complex material was extraordinary. He could read a difficult philosophical text and summarize it with a clarity and precision that the original author might have envied. He could identify the weaknesses in an argument that its proponents had not noticed. He could construct counter-arguments of devastating force. By the time he left Nishapur, he was already one of the most learned men in the Islamic world. The next step in his career came through the patronage of Nizam al-Mulk, the powerful vizier who served the Seljuk sultans. Nizam al-Mulk was not merely a political administrator. He was a cultivated man who took a genuine interest in religious scholarship and who saw the promotion of orthodox Sunni Islam as essential to the stability of the empire. He founded colleges throughout the Seljuk domains, staffed them with distinguished scholars, and created a network of educational institutions that spread orthodox doctrine and trained the empire's religious elite. Al-Ghazali came to the vizier's attention after Al-Juwayni's death in 1085. The young scholar joined Nizam al-Mulk's court, where his brilliance in disputation quickly made him famous. The vizier's camp was a gathering place for scholars and intellectuals, and Al-Ghazali defeated all challengers in debate. His reputation grew until he was acknowledged as the most formidable intellectual at the court. Nizam al-Mulk recognized his talent and rewarded it with the appointment that would define Al-Ghazali's public career. In 1091, at the age of 33, Al-Ghazali was appointed to the Nizamiya College in Baghdad. This was the most prestigious academic position in the Islamic world, the equivalent of holding a chair at the leading university of the time. Baghdad was still the cultural capital of the Islamic world, even if its political power had declined. To teach there was to address the entire community of Muslim scholars. To hold the chair at the Nizamiya was to be recognized as the preeminent defender of orthodox belief. Al-Ghazali threw himself into his new role with characteristic energy. He lectured to audiences of hundreds, sometimes thousands. He wrote prolifically, producing works on theology, law, and philosophy. He engaged in disputes with rivals and emerged victorious. His fame spread throughout the empire and beyond. He was consulted on matters of religious law by scholars from distant regions. He was sought out by students who travelled weeks or months to study under him. He had achieved everything an Islamic scholar could achieve. And it was precisely this achievement that led to his crisis. Success revealed its own emptiness. The applause of crowds, the deference of rivals, the patronage of the powerful, all these rewards proved unable to satisfy the hunger of his soul. He had climbed to the top of the academic world and found nothing there but the reflection of his own ambition. The knowledge he possessed was real, but it had not transformed him. The doctrines he defended were true, but he did not know them in the way that mattered. He was like a physician who could diagnose any disease, but could not heal himself. The crisis that erupted in 1095 had been building throughout his 4 years in Baghdad. The public success masked a private disintegration. He later wrote that during this period, he knew that he was on the brink of a crumbling bank of sand and in imminent danger of hellfire. He saw clearly that continuing his present life would lead to perdition, yet he could not bring himself to abandon it. Each morning he resolved to leave, and each evening his resolve weakened. Worldly desires pulled him in one direction, while the call to the afterlife pulled him in the other. During these years, Al-Ghazali wrote some of his most important works. The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which would establish his reputation as the great critic of the philosophical tradition, was composed during this period of inner turmoil. It is remarkable that he could produce such sophisticated intellectual work while simultaneously experiencing a collapse of confidence in intellectual achievement itself. But this paradox is itself instructive. Al-Ghazali was not abandoning reason. He was questioning whether reason alone could satisfy the deepest human needs. The assassination of his patron Nizam al-Mulk in 1092, killed by an assassin from the Ismaili sect, may have contributed to Al-Ghazali's growing sense of worldly insecurity. The most powerful man in the empire had been struck down, a reminder that no position offered real safety. The political world that had elevated Al-Ghazali could just as easily destroy him. But the deeper crisis was spiritual rather than political. Even if the vizier had lived, even if Al-Ghazali's position had been perfectly secure, the emptiness would have remained. What finally broke the paralysis was not an argument, but a kind of divine intervention. Al-Ghazali described it as a light that God cast into his heart, an illumination that bypassed his rational faculties and showed him directly what he had to do. This light did not provide new information. It transformed his capacity to act on what he already knew. He had known intellectually that worldly attachments were obstacles to spiritual progress. Now he knew it in a way that made action possible. He had understood theoretically that the heart must be purified. Now he experienced the urgency of purification as a matter of life and death. His departure from Baghdad in November 1095 was surrounded by secrecy and misdirection. He told people he was going on pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey that no one could criticize. In fact, he went first to Damascus and did not reach Mecca until much later. He had given up his position, entrusted money for the support of his family, and walked away from everything that had defined his public identity. The most famous scholar in the Islamic world had become a wandering seeker, anonymous, poor, and finally free. Before his departure from Baghdad, Al-Ghazali produced the work that would secure his philosophical reputation, The Incoherence of the Philosophers. This book was a systematic dismantling of the claims made by the Islamic philosophical tradition, particularly as represented by Avicenna. It was not an attack on reason itself, but on the pretensions of philosophers who claim to have achieved certainty through demonstration, when in fact their arguments contained hidden assumptions and unproven premises. The book would shape debates for centuries in both the Islamic world and medieval Europe. To understand what Al-Ghazali was attacking, we must first understand what the philosophers claimed. Avicenna and his predecessors had developed a comprehensive system that explained the nature of God, the origin of the world, the structure of the cosmos, and the destiny of the human soul. They claimed that these conclusions followed necessarily from self-evident premises through valid logical inference. Philosophy, in their view, was not a matter of opinion or belief, but of demonstrative knowledge, as certain as mathematics. A properly trained philosopher could know the truth about ultimate reality with the same confidence that a mathematician knows the Pythagorean theorem. This was a bold claim, and it put philosophy in potential conflict with revealed religion. What if philosophical conclusions contradicted what the Quran taught? The philosophers had answers. Al-Farabi had argued that philosophy and prophecy were two paths to the same truth, with philosophy providing a higher and more precise understanding, while prophecy clothed the same truths in images and stories suitable for ordinary people. Avicenna had developed this approach further, arguing that prophets received the same truths that philosophers discovered, but received them through intuition rather than discursive reasoning. In either case, apparent conflicts between philosophy and revelation could be resolved by interpreting revelation allegorically to match philosophical conclusions. Al-Ghazali rejected this entire approach, but not because he rejected reason. He rejected it because he believed the philosophers had overestimated what reason could achieve. Their proofs were not as certain as they claimed. Their conclusions did not follow necessarily from their premises. The edifice of philosophical knowledge that seemed so imposing was built on foundations that could not support it. To show this, Al-Ghazali first mastered the philosophical tradition completely, then turned that mastery against itself. His method was remarkable. Rather than attacking philosophy from the outside, citing religious authorities against philosophical conclusions, he entered the philosopher's own arena and defeated them on their own terms. He accepted their standards of argument and showed that by those standards their conclusions did not follow. This required an intimate knowledge of the philosophical tradition that few theologians possessed. Al-Ghazali had spent years studying Avicenna's works, and he had written a preliminary book, The Intentions of the Philosophers, that summarized the philosophical system with such clarity and precision that some later readers mistakenly thought he was defending it. The Incoherence examined 20 points on which the philosophers had made claims that Al-Ghazali considered either unproven or outright false. Most of these were technical matters of metaphysics and cosmology that need not concern us here. But 3 of the 20 points were singled out as not merely erroneous but heretical, constituting unbelief that placed the philosophers outside the fold of Islam. These 3 points became the center of the controversy and remain significant for understanding Al-Ghazali's critique. The first charge of unbelief concerned the philosophers' claim that the world is eternal. Avicenna and his predecessors, following Aristotle, had argued that the world had no beginning in time. It emanated from God eternally, just as the light emanates from the sun eternally. There was never a moment when God existed and the world did not. The world flows from God's nature necessarily, not as the result of a choice made at some particular moment. Al-Ghazali argued that this position contradicted the clear teaching of the Quran that God created the heavens and the earth. Creation implies a beginning, a moment when what had not existed came to be. If the world is eternal, then God did not create it in any meaningful sense. He merely is the eternal source of an eternal emanation. This reduces God from a free agent who chooses to create to a mere principle from which reality flows necessarily. It makes God unfree and reduces his majesty. The philosophers responded that creation in time was philosophically incoherent. If God created the world at some particular moment, what was he doing before that? Why did he wait? What changed in him or in his situation that made him create then rather than earlier or later? Any answer to these questions seems to compromise God's perfection and unchangeability. It seems to make God subject to time rather than the master of it. Al-Ghazali's counter-argument was subtle. He accepted that the question of why God created at one moment rather than another could not be answered in terms of prior causes. But this, he argued, was precisely what one should expect if God is truly free. A free choice does not require a determining cause. If it did, it would not be free. God chose to create the world at a particular moment, and his choice was not determined by anything prior. This is what it means for God to be an agent rather than a mere cause. The philosophers, in trying to explain everything in terms of necessary causation, had eliminated genuine agency from the universe, even divine agency. The second charge of unbelief concerned God's knowledge. Avicenna had argued that God knows only universals, not particulars. God knows that there are human beings and what human nature involves, but he does not know that this particular person exists or what this particular person is doing. Particular facts are too numerous and too changeable for a perfect, unchanging mind to encompass. If God knew particulars, his knowledge would have to change constantly as particular things came into being and passed away, and this change would compromise his perfection. Al-Ghazali found this position not merely philosophically weak, but religiously intolerable. A God who does not know particulars does not know me. He does not hear my prayers. He does not see my actions. He does not reward virtue or punish vice in individual cases. This is not the God of the Quran, who knows the fall of every sparrow and the movement of every heart. A God ignorant of particulars might as well not exist for purposes of religious life. Prayer becomes pointless if the one prayed to cannot hear. Moral effort becomes meaningless if the divine judge cannot see what each person does. Al-Ghazali argued that the philosophers' reasoning was flawed. They assumed that knowing particulars would require change in God because particulars change. But this confuses the object of knowledge with the knower. The fact that things change does not mean that the knowledge of those things must change. God can know changing things through unchanging knowledge. His mode of knowing is not like human knowing, which is temporal and discursive. Divine knowledge encompasses all times in a single eternal act of awareness. The philosophers had illicitly transferred the limitations of human cognition to the divine mind. The third charge of unbelief concerned bodily resurrection. The Quran teaches that at the end of time, the dead will be raised bodily to face judgment. The philosophers denied this, arguing that only the soul survives death, and that the soul's afterlife is purely spiritual. They interpreted the Quranic descriptions of paradise and hell as metaphors for spiritual states, not as literal descriptions of physical pleasures and pains. The resurrection of the body, they claimed, was impossible because once the body decays, its matter is dispersed and becomes part of other things. How could it be reconstituted? Al-Ghazali argued that this denial contradicted the explicit teaching of the Quran and thus constituted unbelief. The philosophical arguments against bodily resurrection were not demonstrative proofs, but merely expressions of what the philosophers found difficult to imagine. God's power is not limited by what philosophers can conceive. If God wills to reconstitute the body, he can do so. The matter that composed a body can be gathered again, and even if the same matter cannot be used, God can create new matter configured as the original body was configured. The philosophical objections showed only the limits of philosophical imagination, not the limits of divine power. Beyond these three charges of unbelief, Al-Ghazali developed a more general critique of philosophical method that has had lasting influence. This is his famous critique of causality, which some scholars have seen as anticipating the arguments of the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. The philosophers following Aristotle believed in necessary causal connections. Fire necessarily burns cotton. The sun necessarily melts snow. One billiard ball striking another necessarily causes it to move. These connections are not mere regularities that happen to hold, but necessary truths that could not be otherwise. The fire's nature is to burn, and when fire comes into contact with something combustible, burning necessarily follows. Al-Ghazali argued that we have no access to necessary connections. What we observe is one event following another. The fire touches the cotton, then the cotton burns. We see the sequence, but we do not see the necessity. We assume that the fire caused the burning because fire and burning always appear together in our experience. But this assumption goes beyond what we actually observe. Perhaps the connection is not necessary at all. Perhaps God produces the burning on the occasion of the fire touching the cotton, not because fire has the power to burn, but because God chooses to create burning whenever fire and cotton are brought together. This view, known as occasionalism, makes God the only real cause. What we call natural causes are merely the occasions on which God exercises his power. Fire does not really burn cotton. God burns the cotton when fire is present. This preserves God's omnipotence and creative agency. Nothing happens in the universe except by God's direct action. The regularities we observe are not necessities built into nature, but habits of the divine will. God has chosen to create the world in an orderly way, but he could choose differently. Miracles are possible because God is not bound by natural laws. He could make fire cold or make the dead live because he is the only true agent and his agency is free. This argument has several purposes. It undermines the philosopher's claim to demonstrative knowledge. If we cannot know that fire necessarily burns, then the philosopher's confident assertions about the necessary structure of reality are unfounded. They think they have proven things that cannot be proven. Their demonstrations rest on assumptions about causality that they have not justified. The whole edifice of philosophical knowledge is shakier than it appears. The argument also preserves divine freedom and the possibility of miracles. The Quran records many miracles: the staff of Moses becoming a serpent, Jesus raising the dead, the prophet receiving revelation. If natural causes work necessarily, miracles become inexplicable. How can nature's necessary course be interrupted? The occasionalist answer is simple. There is no necessary course to interrupt. God always acts directly, and when he chooses to act differently than usual, that is what we call a miracle. Critics of Al-Ghazali, beginning with Averroes in the following century, objected that occasionalism makes science impossible. If we cannot know that fire will burn tomorrow just because it burned yesterday, how can we predict anything? How can we act in the world if we cannot rely on regular connections between causes and effects? Al-Ghazali's response was that we can rely on regularities as a practical matter because God has chosen to create an orderly world. We cannot know that the regularities are necessary, but we can know that God has established them and will presumably maintain them. Science proceeds not by discovering necessary connections, but by observing God's habitual action. The incoherence of the philosophers was not the last word on these matters. Averroes wrote a book-length response, The Incoherence of the Incoherence, defending the philosophical tradition against Al-Ghazali's critique. The Spanish Muslim philosopher, writing in Cordoba nearly a century after Al-Ghazali's death, systematically examined each of the 20 arguments and attempted to show that Al-Ghazali had misunderstood or misrepresented the philosopher's positions. Averroes argued that philosophy, properly understood, was compatible with revelation, and that Al-Ghazali had attacked a straw man rather than the genuine philosophical tradition. The debate between Al-Ghazali and Averroes became one of the defining intellectual confrontations of medieval thought. It was not simply a dispute between two individuals, but a clash between two visions of the relationship between reason and faith, philosophy and religion, human intellect and divine revelation. Al-Ghazali insisted that philosophy could not achieve what it claimed to achieve, and that ultimate truth required something beyond rational demonstration. Averroes insisted that philosophy was the highest form of knowledge and that apparent conflicts with revelation could always be resolved through proper interpretation. This debate continued in the Islamic world and was eventually transmitted to medieval Europe through Latin translations. When Christian scholars encountered Arabic philosophy, they also encountered the critique of that philosophy. Thomas Aquinas knew Al-Ghazali's arguments, referred to him by the Latin name Al-Ghazal, and responded to some of them in his own works. The question of whether reason could demonstrate the eternity of the world, which Al-Ghazali had identified as a key point of conflict, became a major issue in 13th century European debates about the relationship between Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. The questions Al-Ghazali raised about causality, about the limits of reason, about the relationship between philosophy and faith have never been definitively settled. They continue to be debated in both religious and secular contexts. Every generation must grapple with them anew, and every thoughtful person must come to some conclusion about them, even if only implicitly. What matters for understanding Al-Ghazali's own journey is that even as he was writing this brilliant demolition of philosophical pretension, he was experiencing in his own life the limitations of intellectual achievement. He could defeat the philosophers in argument, but argument could not heal his soul. He could show that their demonstrations were not truly demonstrative, but this negative achievement did not give him the positive certainty he sought. The incoherence was a clearing of the ground, a removal of false claims. It did not build anything on the cleared ground. That would require a different kind of work altogether. The crisis that engulfed Al-Ghazali was not merely psychological distress, though it expressed itself in physical symptoms. It was an epistemological emergency, a collapse of confidence in the foundations of knowledge itself. Everything he had learned, everything he had taught, everything he had written suddenly seemed uncertain. The question was not whether this or that doctrine was true, but whether he could be certain of anything at all. Al-Ghazali later described this crisis in his spiritual autobiography, Deliverance from Error, a text that has been compared to Augustine's Confessions and Descartes' Meditations. Like those works, it traces a journey from doubt to certainty, from darkness to light. But Al-Ghazali's path was distinctive. He was not recovering faith after a period of unbelief. He had always believed in God, in the Prophet, in the teachings of Islam. What he lost was confidence that his belief constituted knowledge. He believed, but did he know? The crisis began with a reflection on the sources of human knowledge. How do we know anything? The most obvious answer is that we know through sense experience. We see, hear, touch, taste, and smell the world around us, and this sensory contact gives us knowledge of what exists. But can the senses be trusted? Al-Ghazali considered how often the senses deceive. The shadow on a wall seems stationary, but if you watch long enough, you realize it has been moving imperceptibly. The stars appear tiny, but astronomical calculation shows they are enormous. The eye sees a straight stick as bent when it is partially submerged in water. If the senses can err in these cases, how can we be certain they are not erring in others? Perhaps then we should rely not on the senses but on reason. Rational demonstration seems to offer certainty that sensory observation cannot match. We know that 10 is greater than 3, not by counting on our fingers, but by grasping a necessary truth that could not be otherwise. Mathematical and logical certainties seem immune to the deceptions that afflict sensory knowledge. Perhaps these certainties can serve as a foundation on which to build. But Al-Ghazali pushed further. How do we know that reason itself is reliable? We trust reason because its conclusions seem self-evident to us. But what if there is some faculty above reason, just as reason is above sense, that would reveal the errors in our rational thinking? Perhaps what seems self-evident to reason is actually false, and we simply lack the capacity to see its falsity. The dreamer takes his dream experiences to be real until he wakes up. What if our waking rational life is itself a kind of dream from which we have not yet awakened? The Sufis speak of states of consciousness beyond ordinary waking awareness. What if in those states one sees that what reason took to be certain was actually illusion? This argument resembles the radical doubt that Descartes would deploy in his Meditations, written more than 5 centuries later. Descartes, too, asked whether the senses could be trusted, whether dreams might be indistinguishable from waking experience, whether an evil demon might be deceiving us about the most basic truths. The similarity has led some scholars to wonder whether Descartes knew Al-Ghazali's work. Whether or not there was direct influence, both thinkers confronted the same problem: the difficulty of finding a foundation for knowledge that cannot be doubted. Al-Ghazali's crisis was not, however, a purely theoretical exercise. It was existentially urgent. The doubt was not merely a thought experiment, but a lived experience. He found himself unable to trust any of his beliefs, unable to stand on any ground that felt solid. The senses were unreliable. Reason might be unreliable. The teachings he had received from others might be mistaken. Even his own past experiences might have been delusion. There seemed to be nothing he could point to and say with confidence, "This I know." This state of radical doubt lasted, according to Al-Ghazali's own account, for about 2 months. It was a genuinely dangerous condition. A person who cannot trust any beliefs, who sees no path to certainty, may lose the capacity for action altogether. Why do anything if nothing can be known? Why follow any path if all paths might be equally illusory? Al-Ghazali was suspended over an abyss, and the rope he had been climbing had dissolved. The recovery came not through argument, but through what Al-Ghazali called a light from God. He did not reason his way out of doubt. The doubt was about whether reason could be trusted, so reasoning could not resolve it. Instead, something happened that he could only describe in the language of illumination. God cast a light into his heart that restored his capacity to know. The basic truths that had seemed doubtful became evident again, not because he had found new arguments for them, but because he could simply see them once more. This is a crucial moment in Al-Ghazali's intellectual journey. He did not solve the problem of doubt philosophically. He was healed of doubt by a kind of grace. The light that restored certainty was not something he generated through his own efforts, but something received from beyond himself. This experience shaped his understanding of knowledge ever after. Certainty is not something we achieve through argument. It is something we receive when our hearts are properly prepared. The task is not to construct better proofs, but to purify the organ of perception so that truth can be seen. With the immediate crisis resolved, Al-Ghazali turned to a systematic examination of the different paths that claim to lead to truth. He identified 4 groups of seekers: the theologians, the philosophers, the esoteric teachers, and the Sufis. Each group had its methods and its claims. He would examine each in turn, not theoretically, but by immersing himself in their practices and testing their results. The theologians, practitioners of Islamic rational theology, aimed to defend orthodox doctrine through logical argument. They constructed proofs for God's existence, responded to objections, and developed conceptual frameworks for understanding revelation. Al-Ghazali had been trained in this tradition and had contributed to it, but he now saw its limitations. Theology could defend beliefs against attack, but it could not create faith where none existed. It was like medicine that works for those who are already somewhat healthy, but cannot cure the seriously ill. For someone in the grip of radical doubt, theological argument was powerless. It presupposed the very capacities that the doubter could not trust. The philosophers claimed to have achieved demonstrative certainty through pure reason. Al-Ghazali had already dismantled this claim in the Incoherence. The philosophers' proofs were not as certain as they pretended. Their conclusions often contradicted revealed truth, and when they did, it showed not that revelation was wrong, but that their reasoning was flawed. Philosophy was useful for logic, mathematics, and some aspects of natural science. But in metaphysics and theology, it overreached its capacities. It claimed to know what it did not know and led its adherents into error. The esoteric teachers were those who claimed that truth could be known only through the guidance of an infallible authority. In Al-Ghazali's context, this meant primarily the Ismaili Shia, who taught that only the divinely guided Imam could lead people to true knowledge. The appeal of this approach is obvious. It solves the problem of doubt by locating certainty in a trustworthy guide. But Al-Ghazali found it unsatisfying. The question simply shifts to how we know that the claimed authority is truly authoritative. The Ismailis pointed to their Imam, but why should we accept their Imam rather than some other claimant? The demand for an external authority to settle all questions merely postpones the fundamental problem of knowledge. Finally, there were the Sufis, the mystics who sought direct experience of divine reality through spiritual practice. They did not claim that truth could be proven through argument or received from an authority. They claimed that truth could be tasted, experienced directly, known with the immediacy of one's own pain or pleasure. The Sufis spoke of states and stations, of the heart's journey toward its source, of knowledge that comes not from books but from transformation. Al-Ghazali had been aware of Sufism from childhood, having been raised by a Sufi guardian. The memory of that early influence had never left him. Throughout his academic career, he had known that there was another path, a path that his teachers had followed, a path that promised something his learning could not provide. Now he turned to it as the one path he had not yet fully explored. What distinguished the Sufi approach was its recognition that knowledge depends on the state of the knower. A sick person does not taste food properly. A distracted mind does not see what is before its eyes. The heart corrupted by worldly attachments cannot perceive spiritual truth. The problem is not that the truth is hidden, but that the organ of perception is impaired. The task is not to construct better arguments, but to purify the heart so that it can receive what is always being offered. Knowledge, in this understanding, is less like solving a puzzle and more like recovering one's sight. Al-Ghazali read the Sufi masters, Al-Junayd, Abu Yazid al-Bistami, and others. He studied their accounts of the spiritual path, the stations and states they described, the disciplines they recommended, and he recognized something crucial. The Sufi path could not be understood merely by reading about it. Reading about the stages of the path is not the same as traveling them. Knowing the definition of health is not the same as being healthy. Memorizing descriptions of wine is not the same as being intoxicated. If Sufism offered what it claimed to offer, it could be verified only by practice. This realization brought Al-Ghazali face to face with the most difficult choice of his life. He understood intellectually that the Sufi path was the right path, but understanding this was not enough. To walk the path required abandoning everything that tied him to his present life, his position, his reputation, his wealth, his security. The knowledge he sought could be gained only by becoming a different kind of person, and becoming a different kind of person required different kinds of actions. He had to stop living for worldly success and start living for spiritual transformation. But how could he do this? How could he give up everything he had worked for, everything that gave him status and security, everything that made him who he was? This was the deeper crisis behind the physical symptoms. Al-Ghazali knew what he needed to do, but he could not bring himself to do it. His soul was divided. Part of him called toward God and the afterlife. Part of him clung to the world and its rewards. For 6 months, he was paralyzed by this conflict, unable to advance and unable to retreat, his body expressing in illness what his conscious mind could not resolve. The paralysis ended when the deeper part of his soul finally won. He made his choice. He would give up everything and seek what his heart demanded. He arranged for the support of his family, announced that he was going on pilgrimage to Mecca, and departed from Baghdad. The most famous scholar in the Islamic world vanished into obscurity, not knowing if he would find what he sought, knowing only that staying where he was meant spiritual death. The decision was not sudden, though the departure may have seemed so to others. Al-Ghazali had been struggling for 6 months, pulled between his worldly attachments and his spiritual calling. Each day he resolved to leave, and each night he relented. His tongue failed him when he tried to lecture. His stomach refused food. His body was enacting a crisis that his conscious will could not resolve. The physical symptoms were the soul's rebellion against the life it was living, a life that had become intolerable even as it remained outwardly successful. What finally broke the deadlock, Al-Ghazali reported, was not an argument but an illumination. God cast a light into his heart that made action possible. He did not talk himself into leaving through a chain of reasoning. He simply knew, with a clarity that bypassed his conflicted thoughts, that he had to go. The certainty was not intellectual but existential, the kind of knowing that comes when something shifts at the deepest level of the self. The practical arrangements were complicated. Al-Ghazali had a family to support, a wife and children who depended on him. He could not simply abandon them to poverty. He settled money for their support, enough to live on though not lavishly. He entrusted his affairs to people he trusted. He made what provision he could for those he was leaving behind. Even in his urgent need to depart, he did not entirely neglect his worldly responsibilities. He also had to explain his departure to the world. A scholar of his prominence could not simply vanish without comment. Questions would be asked, rumors would spread. He chose to announce that he was going on pilgrimage to Mecca, a pious journey that no one could criticize. This was partly true. He would eventually make the pilgrimage. But it was also a cover story that concealed his deeper intentions. He was not primarily going to Mecca. He was fleeing Baghdad and everything it represented. He was seeking a kind of death so that a new life could be born. The choice of destination is significant. He went first not to Mecca, but to Damascus. This ancient city, with its great mosque and its long tradition of Islamic learning, offered him the anonymity he needed. No one in Damascus knew him. He could live simply, without students demanding his attention, without colleagues expecting his participation in debates, without rulers seeking his counsel. He could disappear into the practice of the spiritual path without the distractions that had corrupted his life in Baghdad. For nearly 2 years, Al-Ghazali lived in the great Umayyad Mosque of Damascus. He practiced the disciplines of the Sufis: regular prayer, fasting, the constant remembrance of God, the examination of conscience. He lived on little, needing little. He kept away from people, not out of misanthropy, but out of a need to focus entirely on the inner work. The transformation he sought could not happen while he was entangled in social obligations and intellectual performances. What was he doing during these long months of retreat? He was trying to purify his heart. In the Sufi understanding that Al-Ghazali had embraced, The heart is the organ of spiritual perception. When the heart is pure, it reflects divine truth like a polished mirror reflects light. When the heart is corrupted by worldly attachments, by pride and ambition, and fear and desire, it becomes like a tarnished mirror that distorts or blocks the light. The task of the spiritual path is to clean the mirror, to remove the tarnish, to restore the heart's capacity to see. The corruptions of the heart are subtle and persistent. Al-Ghazali had recognized that even his religious scholarship had been corrupted by the desire for fame. He had taught not to serve God, but to serve his own reputation. He had argued not to defend truth, but to defeat rivals. His learning had become an instrument of his ego rather than a path to God. This corruption did not disappear simply because he recognized it. It had to be rooted out through sustained practice, through disciplines that slowly weakened the ego's grip and opened space for something else. The practice he followed was demanding. Regular ritual prayer, 5 times a day, but now with full attention rather than the mechanical performance that habit produces. Fasting, not just the required fast of Ramadan, but additional voluntary fasts that weakened the body's demands and strengthened the spirit's concentration. Continuous remembrance of God, keeping the divine presence in mind throughout all activities so that nothing was done without awareness of the one who sees all. Examination of conscience, reviewing each day for failures and recommitting to the path each morning. Reading, but now reading the Sufi masters for guidance on the path rather than reading philosophers to defeat them in argument. The goal was not withdrawal from the world for its own sake. The goal was transformation that would eventually allow a return. The sage who has completed the inner journey does not remain in seclusion forever. He returns to serve, to teach, to guide others on the path he has travelled. But the return must wait until the transformation is genuine. A false return, before the inner work is done, would merely repeat the pattern of corruption. Al-Ghazali had to be certain that when he returned to teaching, he would be teaching from experience rather than merely from learning, from the heart rather than merely from the head. We do not have detailed records of what Al-Ghazali experienced during these years of retreat. He wrote about the Sufi path in general terms, describing the stations and states that seekers pass through. He acknowledged that there are experiences that cannot be adequately described, that must be tasted rather than explained. He compared the difference between knowing about love and experiencing love, between reading about intoxication and being intoxicated. Some things can only be pointed toward. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. What we do know is that something changed in him. The man who left Damascus was not the same man who had arrived. He had tasted what he had previously only described. He had experienced what he had previously only defined. The certainty he had sought through argument had come to him by another route entirely. He still possessed all his intellectual powers. The learning accumulated over a lifetime had not disappeared. But now that learning was grounded in something deeper, an experiential foundation that argument alone could never provide. From Damascus, Al-Ghazali travelled to Jerusalem, then ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, and not yet conquered by the Crusaders. He prayed at the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, sites sacred to Muslims as the place from which the Prophet was said to have ascended to heaven. He spent time in retreat, continuing the inner work he had begun in Damascus. The holy city offered a different atmosphere, a place where the great prophets of the past had walked and taught and died. He visited Hebron, the traditional burial place of Abraham, the patriarch revered by Jews, Christians and Muslims alike. He made the pilgrimage to Mecca, fulfilling the duty required of every Muslim who is able, circling the Kaaba, standing on the plain of Arafat, completing the rituals that connected him to the worldwide community of believers. Then he returned toward home, eventually settling near his birthplace of Tus, living in a Sufi community, teaching a small circle of students, writing the works that would transform Islamic spirituality. The great book of this period was The Revival of the Religious Sciences, an encyclopedic work that synthesized law, theology, and mysticism into a comprehensive guide to the religious life. Al-Ghazali wrote other works as well, including The Alchemy of Happiness, a Persian adaptation of key themes from the Revival for a popular audience, and The Niche of Lights, a profound meditation on a verse of the Quran that describes God as the light of the heavens and the earth. But the Revival was the masterwork, the book that more than any other would shape how Muslims understood and practiced their faith. The 11 years of Al-Ghazali's wandering were not a continuous withdrawal from all social contact. He had periods of complete solitude and periods of engagement with others. He had moments of intense spiritual experience and stretches of ordinary daily routine. The journey was not a steady ascent to ever higher states, but a process with advances and setbacks, illuminations and dark nights. What mattered was the overall transformation, the gradual purification of the heart, the slow death of the false self, and the emergence of something truer. When he finally returned to public teaching in 1106, at the request of the political authorities, he did so as a changed man. He was no longer teaching for fame, but because teaching was what he could offer. He was no longer arguing to defeat opponents, but explaining what he had found so that others might find it too. The return to teaching was not a contradiction of his spiritual journey, but its fruit. The sage who has completed the inner work returns to serve the world, but now without attachment to the world's rewards. Damascus was his first refuge, and it set the pattern for what followed. The great Umayyad Mosque, built on the site of an ancient temple and a Christian church, dominated the city's religious life. Within its vast courtyard, Al-Ghazali found a corner where he could practice the disciplines he had embraced. He prayed the 5 daily prayers with full attention, letting each gesture and phrase become a doorway to presence. He added voluntary prayers, lengthening his time in formal worship, far beyond what the law required. He kept voluntary fasts, weakening the body's hold on his attention and sharpening his awareness of the spirit. The practice of constant remembrance was central to his discipline. In Sufi tradition, the remembrance of God is not merely a formal prayer, but a continuous interior attention, a keeping of divine presence in mind through all activities. Walking, sitting, eating, sleeping. Every moment offers an opportunity to remember. The goal is to reach a state where the awareness of God becomes as natural as breathing, so deeply ingrained that forgetting becomes difficult. This practice rewires the habits of attention that keep most people focused on worldly concerns, gradually freeing the practitioner from the tyranny of distraction. Al-Ghazali also engaged in what he called examination of the soul. Each day, he reviewed his actions and intentions, looking for the subtle corruptions that ego introduces into even pious activities. Did he pray well to please God or to feel pleased with himself? Did he fast sincerely or to prove his spiritual accomplishments? The ego is cunning. It can hijack religious practice and turn it into another form of self-aggrandizement. Only constant vigilance can detect its infiltrations. This self-examination had to be honest, neither excusing faults nor exaggerating them, simply seeing what was there so that it could be addressed. The 2 years in Damascus were not unbroken solitude. Al-Ghazali interacted with other Sufis, received guidance from more experienced practitioners, participated in the communal rhythms of the mosque. But the center of his life was the inner work, the slow purification of intention, the gradual strengthening of the heart's connection to its true object. The world outside the mosque continued its business. Empires rose and fell. Armies marched and fought. But in his corner of the courtyard, a more essential battle was being waged. Jerusalem drew him next, the city sacred to 3 faiths, where prophets had walked and revelations had descended. The dome of the rock with its golden cupola marked the spot from which Muhammad was said to have ascended through the heavens in his night journey. The Al-Aqsa Mosque at the southern end of the sacred precinct was the destination of that miraculous journey, the farthest mosque to which the Prophet travelled before his ascent. To pray in these places was to connect with the deepest currents of the prophetic tradition. Al-Ghazali spent time in Jerusalem in contemplation and prayer, adding this holy city to the sacred geography of his wandering. He also visited Hebron, where Abraham is said to be buried, the father of prophets, the friend of God. These places were not merely tourist destinations but stations of spiritual power, locations where the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds seemed thinner than elsewhere. To visit them was to draw on the accumulated blessings of centuries of pilgrimage and prayer. The Crusaders had not yet arrived. The First Crusade had been called in the year of Al-Ghazali's crisis, 1095, but the armies were still making their way across Europe and through Anatolia. Jerusalem would fall to the Crusaders in 1099, and a Christian kingdom would be established that would last for nearly a century. Al-Ghazali visited the holy city in its final years of Muslim rule, though he left no record of awareness that great changes were coming. His concerns were internal rather than political, focused on the journey of the soul rather than the movements of armies. From Jerusalem, Al-Ghazali made his way to Mecca for the pilgrimage. This was the fulfillment of the ostensible purpose of his departure from Baghdad, the justification he had given for leaving his post. The pilgrimage is one of the 5 pillars of Islam required of every Muslim who is physically and financially able to make the journey. It involves travelling to Mecca during the designated month, entering a state of ritual purity, circling the Kaaba 7 times, running between the hills of Safa and Marwa, standing on the plain of Arafat in prayer, and completing various other rituals that commemorate the life of Abraham and Hagar. The pilgrimage strips away the distinctions that normally separate people. Rich and poor, learned and illiterate, ruler and subject, all wear the same simple garments of white cloth. All perform the same rituals. All submit to the same requirements. The hierarchies that structure ordinary life dissolve in the common identity of pilgrims before God. This levelling has spiritual significance. It reminds the pilgrim that worldly distinctions are ultimately unimportant, that what matters is not status or achievement, but the state of the heart before its creator. For Al-Ghazali, the pilgrimage was not merely a duty discharged, but an experience that deepened his transformation. The journey itself was demanding, crossing harsh terrain in the company of thousands of other pilgrims. The heat of the Arabian desert, the discomfort of travel, the press of crowds, all these challenged the body while providing opportunities for spiritual growth. The rituals were physically exhausting, performed in the scorching sun among vast multitudes of believers. But this physical challenge could become spiritual opportunity. The discomfort of the body could loosen the soul's grip on bodily ease. The presence of millions of fellow Muslims, all dressed alike, all performing the same rituals, all directing their hearts toward the same God, could dissolve the sense of individual separateness that usually dominates consciousness. The standing at Arafat, the central ritual of the pilgrimage, is said to prefigure the day of judgment when all humanity will stand before God. The pilgrim stands in the open, exposed to the sun, praying and reflecting, aware of mortality and accountability. This experience can be transformative for those who enter it with the right disposition. Al-Ghazali had spent years preparing his disposition. The pilgrimage came as a culmination rather than a beginning, a confirmation of what he had already learned rather than the start of his learning. After the pilgrimage, Al-Ghazali did not return to Baghdad or seek another position. Instead, he made his way back toward his homeland, eventually settling near Tus, the city of his birth. He lived in a Sufi community, a small group of practitioners who followed the spiritual path together. He taught, but informally, to students who sought him out, rather than to crowds who came because of his famous position. He wrote, producing during this period his greatest and most influential works. The revival of the religious sciences was composed during these years, an enormous undertaking that synthesized everything Al-Ghazali had learned into a comprehensive guide to the religious life. The book grew organically out of his own practice and teaching. It addressed not only scholars but anyone who wanted to live a life oriented toward God. It covered topics from the proper performance of ritual prayer to the diseases of the heart that corrupt spiritual life, from the ethics of marriage and friendship to the stages of the path to divine love. Nothing like it had been written before, and nothing quite like it would be written after. The living conditions were simple. Al-Ghazali had given away his wealth before leaving Baghdad and had no desire to accumulate more. He owned little beyond what was necessary for basic survival. He dressed simply, ate simply, lived simply. This simplicity was not deprivation but liberation. The fewer things a person needs, the fewer things can disturb his peace. The world's power over a person diminishes in proportion to his attachment to what the world offers. Al-Ghazali was practicing what he preached, demonstrating in his own life the teaching he was writing into his books. Yet the simplicity coexisted with intense intellectual activity. The books Al-Ghazali wrote during this period are not the products of a mind that has ceased to function, but of a mind operating at its highest capacity, now in service of transformed purposes. The learning of a lifetime poured into works designed to help others on the path he had travelled. The analytical power that had demolished the philosophers was now applied to mapping the interior landscape of the spiritual life. The rhetorical skill that had swayed thousands in Baghdad now crafted prose that would guide millions for centuries. The contrast with his earlier life could not be sharper. In Baghdad, he had been surrounded by admirers and rivals, caught up in the competitions and intrigues of academic life, performing his brilliance for audiences that rewarded him with fame. Now he lived quietly among a small group of seekers, writing not for applause, but for guidance, teaching not to demonstrate superiority, but to share what he had found. The external circumstances had changed completely. But the change in circumstances reflected and facilitated a deeper change, the transformation of the heart from which all else followed. The 11 years of wandering were not a retreat from life, but an engagement with life at a different level. The battles Al-Ghazali fought during this period were not with other scholars, but with his own ego. The victories he won were not in debates, but over the forces that corrupt the soul. When he finally returned to public teaching, he brought with him the fruits of these interior battles, a wisdom grounded not in learning alone, but in experience that had tested and validated what learning described. The revival of the religious sciences stands as Al-Ghazali's masterwork, the book for which he is most remembered, the text that more than any other shaped the practice of Islam in the centuries that followed. It is an enormous work, comprising 40 books organized into 4 quarters, covering every aspect of the religious life, from ritual worship to the love of God. No book in the Islamic tradition, except the Quran itself, has had comparable influence on how Muslims understand and practice their faith. The title itself announces the book's ambition. Al-Ghazali believed that the religious sciences had become dead letter, formal knowledge disconnected from living practice. Scholars could debate fine points of law while their own hearts remained untransformed. Theologians could construct elaborate proofs while lacking direct experience of what they proved. The sciences were there, but the life had gone out of them. Al-Ghazali's book was an attempt to revive them, to show how formal knowledge must be connected to interior transformation if it is to accomplish its true purpose. The 4 quarters of the book follow a careful structure. The first quarter addresses acts of worship: prayer, charity, fasting, pilgrimage, and the recitation of the Quran. These are the formal obligations of every Muslim, the duties that shape daily and yearly life. Al-Ghazali does not merely explain how to perform these acts correctly according to the requirements of the law. He explores their inner meaning, the intentions and attentions that should accompany the outward forms. Prayer performed mechanically, while the mind wanders to other concerns, is prayer in name only. True prayer requires presence, a gathering of attention that brings the worshipper into the presence of the one worshipped. Take the example of ritual prayer, which Muslims perform 5 times daily. The law specifies the physical movements: standing, bowing, prostrating, sitting. It specifies the words to be recited, the direction to face, the times when prayer is required. A scholar of law could teach all this with precision, enabling a student to perform prayers that are technically valid. But Al-Ghazali is concerned with more than technical validity. He asks what is happening in the heart of the one who prays. Prayer can be performed while the mind is entirely elsewhere. The body goes through the motions, the tongue pronounces the words, but the consciousness is occupied with plans for tomorrow, memories of yesterday, anxieties about problems unrelated to prayer. This kind of prayer satisfies the legal requirement but misses the point. The point is encounter with God, turning away from everything else to face the one who is always present. If that turning does not happen, if the heart remains distracted while the body prays, then the essence of prayer is absent even while its form is preserved. Al-Ghazali teaches practices for cultivating presence in prayer. Before beginning, one should take time to settle the mind, to put aside other concerns, to remember what one is about to do and who one is about to address. During prayer, one should pay attention to the meaning of the words rather than reciting them automatically. One should visualize oneself standing before God, exposed to the divine gaze, seeking mercy and guidance. One should let the physical positions express interior states: humility in bowing, complete submission in prostration. Each prayer can become a genuine encounter if the necessary attention is brought to it. The same pattern applies to the other acts of worship. Charity is not merely giving money to the poor, though it includes that. It is training the heart to let go of attachment to wealth, to recognize that everything we have is a trust from God rather than a possession we own, to cultivate generosity as a quality of character rather than an occasional act. Fasting is not merely abstaining from food and drink during daylight hours. It is training in self-discipline, the strengthening of will against the body's demands, the cultivation of sympathy for those who are hungry not by choice but by poverty. Pilgrimage is not merely traveling to Mecca and performing certain rituals. It is symbolic death and rebirth, leaving behind everything familiar, joining a community of equals before God, returning to the origins of the faith. The second quarter of the revival addresses social customs: marriage, earning a living, friendship, travel, and similar matters. Here too, Al-Ghazali is concerned with the interior dimension. Marriage is not merely a contract for sexual access and the production of children. It is a partnership in the journey toward God, a relationship that can support spiritual growth when approached rightly or obstruct it when approached wrongly. The choice of a spouse, the conduct of family life, the raising of children. All these have implications for the state of the soul. Earning a living presents its own spiritual challenges. How does one participate in economic life without being corrupted by greed? How does one seek success without making success an idol? Al-Ghazali explores the ethics of commerce, the dangers of wealth, the proper attitude toward property and possessions. The goal is not to withdraw from economic activity, but to engage in it without being captured by it, to earn what is needed while remembering that worldly goods are means rather than ends. Friendship too has spiritual significance. The people we associate with shape our character, for better or worse. Companions who encourage virtue make it easier to be virtuous. Companions who normalize vice make it harder to resist. Al-Ghazali advises caution in choosing friends, fidelity in maintaining friendships, and honesty in the duties friends owe to each other. True friendship is not mere enjoyment of each other's company, but mutual assistance on the path to God. The third quarter is the heart of the book, the section that most fully expresses Al-Ghazali's distinctive contribution. It addresses the diseases of the heart, the moral and spiritual corruptions that obstruct the path to God: pride, envy, anger, greed, love of the world, ostentation, self-deception. Each disease receives its own detailed treatment. Al-Ghazali analyzes the nature of each corruption, its causes, its symptoms, and its cure. Pride may be the most fundamental disease. It is the assertion of self above others, the claim to superiority that puts the ego at the center of the world. Pride can attach to any excellence: physical beauty, intellectual brilliance, social status, religious learning. Whatever a person is good at can become an occasion for pride, and pride corrupts everything it touches. The proud scholar uses learning to dominate rather than to serve. The proud worshipper performs acts of devotion to demonstrate superiority rather than to approach God. Pride makes genuine knowledge impossible because the proud person already knows how great he is and resists any truth that might disturb this flattering picture. The cure for pride is not self-hatred, but accurate self-knowledge. The proud person exaggerates his virtues and ignores his faults. Honest self-examination reveals a more complicated picture. Yes, there may be genuine excellences, but there are also failures, limitations, dependencies on others and on God. Seeing oneself accurately produces humility, not as a performance, but as a natural response to truth. The humble person does not deny his gifts, but recognizes that they are gifts, not achievements, and that they bring responsibility rather than grounds for boasting. Envy is the pain felt at another's good fortune. It differs from simple desire for what another has. Envy includes a wish that the other did not have it. The envious person is not satisfied to gain what she lacks. She wants the other person to lose what he has. This malicious quality makes envy particularly destructive. It poisons relationships, turns friends into rivals, makes every social setting a competition in which one person's gain is another's loss. Al-Ghazali traces envy to a fundamental error. The envious person assumes that goods are finite, that if someone else has something, there is less for everyone else. This assumption is false for the most important goods. If my neighbor becomes wise, his wisdom does not diminish the supply of wisdom available to me. If my friend grows in virtue, her virtue does not reduce the virtue I might attain. The goods of the spirit are not zero-sum. Understanding this can relax the grip of envy and open space for genuine appreciation of others' excellences. Anger, greed, love of the world, and the other diseases receive similarly thorough treatment. For each, Al-Ghazali explores the psychology, identifies the spiritual danger, and prescribes remedies. The remedies typically combine intellectual understanding with practical discipline. Understanding why a vice is harmful provides motivation for change, but understanding alone is rarely sufficient. The heart must be trained through repeated practice, through catching the vice as it arises and redirecting attention, through cultivating the opposite virtue until it becomes habitual. The fourth quarter addresses the path to salvation: repentance, patience, gratitude, fear and hope, poverty and renunciation, trust in God, love, longing, and intimacy. This is the positive complement to the third quarter's diagnosis of disease. Having identified what corrupts the heart, Al-Ghazali now maps the virtues that heal it and the practices that cultivate them. Repentance comes first because nothing else can begin without it. Repentance is the turning of the heart from what is wrong toward what is right, from the world to God, from the service of the ego to the service of truth. It involves recognition that one has been on the wrong path, regret for the harm one has done, and resolution to change. Without repentance, the diseases of the heart remain in place and obstruct further progress. The subsequent virtues build on each other. Patience sustains the seeker through difficulties, preventing discouragement when progress is slow or setbacks occur. Gratitude keeps attention focused on the gifts one has received rather than on what one lacks. Fear of God motivates avoidance of what is forbidden. Hope in God motivates pursuit of what is commanded. Poverty here means not destitution, but detachment, owning things without being owned by them. Trusting God allows release of anxious striving, confidence that the outcome is in better hands than one's own. The culmination is love. Love of God is not merely a pleasant feeling, but the reorientation of the heart's fundamental desire. The human heart is made to love, and it will attach itself to something. Most people love worldly things: wealth, status, pleasure, power. These attachments enslave because worldly things are unreliable and passing. The heart attached to them is continually disturbed by fear of loss. But the heart that attaches to God attaches to what cannot be taken away, what does not diminish, what is always available. This love brings peace because its object is always present and always faithful. The revival is not easy reading. It is long, detailed, demanding. Al-Ghazali does not simplify for the sake of accessibility. He assumes readers who are willing to engage seriously with difficult material, who will read carefully and think deeply, who will not be satisfied with superficial understanding. The book rewards such readers with insights that continue to illuminate even after multiple readings. The style varies according to subject matter. When discussing legal matters, Al-Ghazali is precise and technical, distinguishing cases and conditions with the care that legal reasoning requires. When discussing the diseases of the heart, he is psychological and introspective, probing the hidden corners of motivation and desire. When discussing the stages of the spiritual path, he becomes lyrical, reaching for language that can evoke experiences that words cannot fully capture. This variety keeps the reader engaged across the enormous length of the work. One of the distinctive features of the revival is its integration of practical advice with theoretical understanding. Al-Ghazali does not merely explain what pride is, he tells readers how to recognize it in themselves and what to do about it. He does not merely describe the stages of the spiritual path, he provides guidance for traveling each stage. The book is not a treatise to be studied from a distance, but a manual to be used in the work of transformation. The impact of this approach has been enormous. For centuries, Muslims seeking guidance on how to live their faith have turned to the revival. It has been read in mosques and schools, in Sufi lodges and private homes. It has been summarized, commented upon, translated, and adapted. It has shaped the practice of prayer, the conduct of family life, the approach to moral struggle across the Islamic world. Al-Ghazali's influence through this single work exceeds the influence of most scholars through their entire corpus. The revival became the standard against which other works of religious guidance were measured. Later scholars built upon it, criticized it, developed it, but they could not ignore it. It established the framework within which discussions of the religious life would proceed. Whatever else Al-Ghazali accomplished, this book alone would secure his place among the most influential figures in Islamic history. The heart in Al-Ghazali's understanding is not primarily the physical organ that pumps blood. It is the spiritual center of the human being, the seat of knowing, willing, and feeling in their deepest dimensions. The Arabic word he uses can also be translated as mind or soul, and his concept incorporates aspects of all these English terms. The heart in this sense is what we most essentially are, the inner reality that animates the body and survives its death, the place where we encounter God or turn away from Him. The heart can be healthy or sick. A healthy heart perceives truth clearly, loves what is genuinely good, and wills what it should will. A sick heart is clouded in its perception, disordered in its loves, and weak or misdirected in its will. The diseases that Al-Ghazali describes are not primarily problems of belief, but problems of character, not errors about doctrine, but corruptions of the soul. A person can believe all the right things while her heart remains sick, and a sick heart will eventually produce wrong actions, wrong beliefs, and spiritual disaster. The imagery Al-Ghazali often uses is that of a mirror. The heart is like a mirror that can reflect divine light when it is clean and properly oriented. When the mirror is polished and turned toward the source of light, it shines brightly. When the mirror is tarnished or turned away, it remains dark. The diseases of the heart are like rust on the mirror, obscuring its reflective capacity. The spiritual disciplines are like the polishing that removes the rust and restores the shine. Pride receives extensive treatment because it is in some sense the root of all other diseases. Pride is the assertion of self above others and ultimately above God. The proud person makes himself the center of the world, the standard by which everything else is measured. This self-centeredness distorts everything. It makes accurate self-knowledge impossible because the proud person cannot bear to see his faults. It makes genuine relationship with others impossible because the proud person uses others to affirm his superiority rather than encountering them as equals. It makes relationship with God impossible because pride refuses to submit. Al-Ghazali distinguishes several forms of pride. There is the pride that comes from physical qualities, beauty, strength, health. There is the pride that comes from social position, noble ancestry, political power, wealth. There is the pride that comes from accomplishments, skill in a craft, victory in competition, success in business, and most dangerously, there is the pride that comes from religious achievements, knowledge of scripture, strict observance of law, spiritual experiences. This last form is most dangerous because it corrupts the very means of cure. The person who is proud of his humility has a peculiarly virulent disease. The proud scholar Al-Ghazali knew from personal experience is a particularly problematic case. Learning is supposed to lead to wisdom, which includes accurate self-assessment. But learning can instead become a source of vanity, a weapon for defeating rivals, a way of demonstrating superiority. The scholar who has mastered difficult material easily begins to despise those who have not. He uses his knowledge to win arguments rather than to find truth. He is more interested in being right than in understanding. His learning, which should have made him humble before the vastness of what he does not know, instead puffs him up with a sense of his own importance. The cure for pride begins with reflection on one's real situation. Where did your gifts come from? You did not create your own intelligence. You did not choose your circumstances of birth. You had teachers who guided you, friends who supported you, a society that made your development possible. Whatever you have achieved depended on countless factors beyond your control. This is not a reason for shame but for gratitude. The proper response to gifts is thankfulness, not arrogance. Furthermore, what have you actually accomplished compared to what you might have accomplished? The proud person focuses on his achievements. Honest self-examination reveals the failures, the missed opportunities, the times when one chose poorly. Even in areas of genuine excellence, how much higher might one have risen with greater effort, greater courage, greater wisdom? The proud person inflates his successes and minimizes his failures. Truth punctures this inflation. And ultimately, what are any human accomplishments compared to the divine? The brightest human mind is a dim spark compared to the infinite light of God. The greatest human virtue is pale beside divine goodness. The proud person forgets this comparison and sees only his position relative to other humans. Remembering God puts human pride in its proper perspective. Before the infinite, all finite differences shrink to insignificance. Envy receives similarly thorough treatment. Envy is the pain felt at another's good fortune, the wish that someone else did not have what they have. It is not merely wanting something for oneself, but wanting to deprive another of it. This malicious quality makes envy uniquely destructive. It poisons relationships, turns natural admiration into resentment, makes every social comparison a source of suffering. Al-Ghazali traces envy to several sources. One is the sense that goods are limited, that if someone else has something, there is less for me. This is sometimes true for material goods. There is only so much gold in the world. But it is false for spiritual goods, which are not diminished by being shared. Another person's wisdom does not reduce the supply of wisdom available to me. Another person's virtue does not exhaust the world's stock of virtue. Recognizing this can weaken the grip of envy. Another source of envy is injured pride. When someone else succeeds in an area where I thought I was superior, my sense of my own importance is threatened. The solution is the same as the solution to pride. Accurate self-assessment that does not depend on being better than others. If I do not need to be the best, then another's excellence does not threaten me. I can admire it, learn from it, be glad for it. Yet another source is the assumption that another's success somehow diminishes me. If my colleague is promoted, I feel less valuable. If my neighbor prospers, I feel poorer. But these comparative judgments are choices, not necessities. I can choose to measure myself against my own potential rather than against others' achievements. I can find my value in my relationship with God rather than in my rank among humans. Anger is another disease that Al-Ghazali examines in detail. Some anger is justified. Anger at injustice, anger at cruelty, anger at violations of the sacred. This kind of anger motivates action to correct wrongs and should not be eliminated but channeled appropriately. But much anger is excessive, disproportionate, or misdirected. It flares up at trivial provocations. It damages relationships. It consumes energy that could be better used. It distorts perception, making enemies out of people who could be friends. The cure for excessive anger involves several elements. One is simply pausing before acting on anger, creating space between the stimulus and the response. In that space, cooler assessment becomes possible. Is the offense as serious as it first seemed? Is anger the appropriate response? What will anger accomplish? These questions often reveal that what seemed an outrage is actually minor, that anger will make things worse rather than better, that a more measured response would be wiser. Another element is understanding the sources of anger. Often anger arises from wounded pride. Someone has disrespected me, failed to give me what I deserve, treated me as less important than I am. Seeing this connection allows the cure for pride to work against anger as well. If I do not need to be important, then failures of respect do not wound me. If my value does not depend on how others treat me, then mistreatment does not threaten me. Greed, love of the world, ostentation, and the other diseases receive comparable treatment. In each case, Al-Ghazali analyzes the disease's nature, traces its causes, identifies its dangers, and prescribes remedies. The remedies typically combine intellectual understanding with practical discipline. Understanding why a vice is harmful provides motivation for change, but change requires practice, the repeated choice of what is right until right choosing becomes habitual. What unifies all these discussions is the central concern with the state of the heart. The diseases are not primarily about behavior, but about the inner dispositions that generate behavior. A person might avoid actions associated with envy while still harboring envious feelings. This is better than acting on the feelings, but it is not yet health. True health requires transformation of the feelings themselves, so that the heart genuinely rejoices in others' good fortune, rather than merely suppressing its resentment. This focus on interior transformation distinguishes Al-Ghazali's approach from legalism, which focuses primarily on external compliance. The law specifies what actions are required, forbidden, and permitted. A legalistic approach emphasizes conformity to these specifications. Al-Ghazali does not reject the law, but he insists that the law addresses only the surface. Beneath the surface, the heart may be healthy or sick, and the state of the heart matters more than the correctness of outward behavior. The saints, Al-Ghazali writes, are not those who have mastered the rules, but those who have purified their hearts. They may or may not be learned in law. They may or may not hold positions of religious authority. What distinguishes them is the quality of their interior life, their freedom from pride and envy and anger and greed, their love of God that orders all lesser loves, their peace that comes from trust in the one who holds all things. This interior transformation is what the religious life is ultimately about, and no amount of external compliance can substitute for it. Al-Ghazali's critique of the philosophers was not a rejection of reason, but a clarification of its limits. Reason is necessary for certain purposes, establishing the validity of arguments, identifying logical fallacies, organizing knowledge systematically. But reason alone cannot achieve the highest form of knowledge, the direct experience of truth that the Sufis call experiential knowledge or gnosis. To reach this higher knowledge, something beyond argument is required. The distinction between propositional knowledge and experiential knowledge is central to Al-Ghazali's epistemology. Propositional knowledge is knowledge that something is the case. It can be expressed in statements that are true or false. One can learn propositional knowledge from books, teachers, or reasoning. It can be communicated from one mind to another through language. Most of what we call education consists of acquiring propositional knowledge. Experiential knowledge is different. It cannot be fully expressed in propositions, though propositions can point toward it. It cannot be transmitted through language, though language can indicate where to look. It must be had directly through one's own experience. Someone who has never tasted honey cannot know what honey tastes like, no matter how many descriptions he reads or how accurate those descriptions are. The knowledge of taste is accessible only to one who tastes. Al-Ghazali uses numerous examples to illustrate this distinction. Consider the difference between knowing about health and being healthy. A physician may have complete propositional knowledge about health, what it is, what causes it, how to maintain it. But if the physician is sick, this knowledge does not make him healthy. He knows about health without having it. Conversely, a person who has never studied medicine may be perfectly healthy. He has health without knowing about it. The ideal, of course, is to combine both, to be healthy and to understand health. But these are two distinct achievements, not one. Or consider the difference between knowing about love and being in love. One can study poetry and psychology, gaining sophisticated understanding of what love is and how it works. But this understanding is not itself love. The person in love may be inarticulate, unable to analyze his experience theoretically, yet he possesses something the learned student of love does not have. Again, the ideal combines both, to love and to understand love. but loving is not the same as understanding love. The application to spiritual knowledge is direct. One can learn about God from theology, his attributes, his actions, his relationship to creation. This propositional knowledge has its value. It protects against errors, provides a framework for understanding, enables communication with others about spiritual matters. But propositional knowledge of God is not the same as direct knowledge of God. The theologian who has mastered all the proofs may never have experienced what the proofs point toward. The simple believer who cannot construct a single theological argument may live in intimate awareness of divine presence. This distinction helps explain Al-Ghazali's crisis and its resolution. He had possessed propositional knowledge about God and the spiritual life in abundance. He could discuss, define, prove, refute. But he lacked experiential knowledge. His learning was about the truth rather than of the truth. This is why argument could not resolve his doubt. Doubt about the reliability of reason cannot be answered by reasoning, which would be circular. What resolved his doubt was not a better argument, but a direct illumination that bypassed argument altogether. The path to experiential knowledge requires transformation of the knower. This is why the purification of the heart is not merely moral advice, but epistemological necessity. The corrupted heart cannot perceive spiritual truth, just as the diseased eye cannot perceive physical light. The diseases of the heart, pride and envy and anger and the rest, cloud the heart's vision and distort its perception. Remove the diseases and the heart can see. Leave them in place and the heart remains blind no matter how sophisticated its theories. The transformation required is not primarily intellectual. It involves the whole person: body, emotions, habits, relationships, daily practices. This is why Al-Ghazali emphasizes spiritual disciplines: prayer, fasting, remembrance, examination of conscience. These disciplines work on all aspects of the person, not just the thinking mind. They weaken the ego's hold on attention. They strengthen the heart's capacity for presence. They create space in which something new can emerge. Al-Ghazali does not claim that experiential knowledge is available to everyone who wants it. The path is demanding, and many who begin do not complete it. But he insists that it is real, that it is available, and that it is ultimately what the religious life aims at. Propositional knowledge is not enough. Correct belief is not enough. Even sincere practice is not enough if practice remains external and does not transform the heart. What is needed is direct knowledge, the tasting that removes all doubt. The comparison with Descartes is instructive. Both thinkers confronted radical doubt about the foundations of knowledge. Both asked how we can be certain of anything, but their solutions differed dramatically. Descartes sought certainty through a rigorous method of reasoning that would arrive at indubitable first principles from which all other knowledge could be derived. He found his foundation in the famous cogito, I think, therefore I am. The certainty of his own existence as a thinking thing was the rock on which he rebuilt the edifice of knowledge. Al-Ghazali's solution was quite different. He did not find certainty through reasoning, but through an illumination that bypassed reasoning. The light that God cast into his heart was not a conclusion reached through argument, but a direct perception that made argument unnecessary. The certainty he achieved was not propositional, but experiential, not a matter of logic, but of sight. Once he had seen, doubt was not merely answered, but dissolved. This does not mean that Al-Ghazali became anti-intellectual. He continued to write, argue, and teach. His intellectual powers remained formidable to the end of his life. But he now understood those powers differently. Reason was a tool, valuable for certain purposes, inadequate for others. The highest knowledge lay beyond reason's reach, accessible only through a transformation that prepared the heart to receive what reason could not grasp. The prophets, in Al-Ghazali's understanding, exemplified this higher knowledge. They did not arrive at truth through philosophical reasoning. They received it directly through revelation. Their knowledge was not inference but perception, not conclusion but vision. This is why prophets can speak with an authority that philosophers lack. The philosopher constructs arguments that others can evaluate and potentially refute. The prophet proclaims what he has seen, and his proclamation carries a different kind of certainty. Ordinary believers cannot be prophets, but they can, according to Al-Ghazali, attain something analogous to prophetic knowledge through the Sufi path. They can purify their hearts until those hearts become capable of receiving divine illumination. They can practice the disciplines that weaken the ego and strengthen the spirit. They can travel the stations of the path that the great Sufis have mapped. And they can arrive, perhaps, at a direct knowledge of God that transforms everything they thought they knew. This vision places the Sufi path at the center of the religious life. Not every Muslim can become a philosopher, nor does Al-Ghazali think philosophy is the highest path even for those who can. Not every Muslim can become a master of law, nor is legal expertise the ultimate goal. But every Muslim can, in principle, pursue the purification of the heart and the direct knowledge of God that it makes possible. This is the path Al-Ghazali himself travelled, and his books are invitations to others to travel it too. The implications for education are significant. Traditional Islamic education focused on transmitting propositional knowledge, the text of the Quran, the prophetic traditions, the rulings of the law, the arguments of theology. Al-Ghazali does not reject this kind of education, but he relativizes it. Propositional knowledge is a beginning, not an end. It provides the framework within which deeper knowledge can be sought. But it is not itself the knowledge that matters most. The goal is transformation, and transformation requires more than information. This is why Al-Ghazali wrote the revival as he did. The book transmits propositional knowledge, certainly. It contains information about prayer, fasting, ethics, and the stages of the spiritual path. But it is designed to do more than inform. It is designed to transform. The descriptions of the diseases of the heart are meant not merely to identify those diseases, but to help readers recognize them in themselves and begin the work of cure. The guidance on spiritual practice is meant not merely to explain what practitioners do, but to enable readers to practice themselves. The book points beyond itself to an engagement that books cannot replace. The reasons for his return were complex. He had originally left because his teaching had been corrupted by worldly motives, the desire for fame, the enjoyment of applause, the satisfaction of defeating rivals. These motives had emptied his work of its true purpose and had left him spiritually sick. But now, after years of practice and transformation, his motives were different. He no longer needed the approval of audiences. He no longer cared about fame or victory in debate. He could teach from a different place, a place of service rather than self-aggrandizement. There was also the consideration that knowledge should be shared. The experiences he had gained, the insights he had won, the guidance he could offer, these were not meant for him alone. To keep them to himself when others might benefit would be a kind of hoarding, a spiritual version of the greed he had worked so hard to overcome. The sage who has completed the inner journey does not remain in seclusion forever. He returns to the world to serve, but now without attachment to the world's rewards. The appointment was not to Baghdad, where he had taught before, but to Nishapur, the city where he had studied under Al-Juwayni decades earlier. This was the intellectual center of the Eastern Islamic world, an important position, but not the supreme position he had held in Baghdad. Perhaps this was appropriate. Al-Ghazali was no longer seeking the highest position for its own sake. he was willing to teach wherever teaching could be useful. The teaching he offered was different from what he had offered before. He had been a brilliant lecturer, capable of dazzling audiences with his eloquence and defeating opponents with his argumentation. These powers had not disappeared. His intellect remained as sharp as ever. But now the brilliance was in service of something larger. He taught not to demonstrate his own excellence, but to guide seekers on the path he had travelled. He argued not to win debates, but to clear away obstacles that blocked spiritual progress. He also continued to write. The works of this final period include some of his most important books. The Alchemy of Happiness is a Persian adaptation of key themes from the Revival, designed for a popular audience that might not read the longer Arabic original. It presents the essential teachings about self-knowledge, knowledge of God, knowledge of this world and the next, in accessible language. The title suggests the transformative aim. Alchemy is the art of turning base metals into gold, and spiritual alchemy turns the base material of the untransformed soul into something precious. The Niche of Lights is a more esoteric work, a meditation on the light verse of the Quran, which describes God as the light of the heavens and the earth. Al-Ghazali explores the symbolism of light, the levels of meaning in the verse, and the relationship between the visible light that the eyes perceive and the spiritual light that the purified heart perceives. This is one of his most philosophically dense works, engaging with the Neoplatonic tradition while subordinating it to Islamic purposes. His teaching in Nishapur did not last long. After a few years, he returned to his hometown of Tus, where he established a Sufi community and a school for teaching religious law. This was a quieter existence than either his years in Baghdad or his return to Nishapur. He lived among a small group of disciples, teaching, writing, practicing the disciplines he had mastered during his years of wandering. The great public career was behind him. What remained was the simpler work of guiding those who came to him and completing his own journey. The final years were marked by illness. Al-Ghazali's health had never been robust, and the rigours of his spiritual practices may have weakened him further. He continued to teach and write as long as he was able, but his body was wearing out. In December of 1111, he died at his home in Tus, just short of his 54th birthday. The story of his death has been told in various forms. According to one account, he rose early, performed the dawn prayer, asked for his burial shroud, kissed it, placed it over his eyes, and said that he was obedient to the command to enter the presence of his Lord. Then he stretched out his feet and died. Whether or not the details are accurate, they capture something of how his followers remembered him. A man who faced death with acceptance and trust, who had spent his life preparing for this moment, and who met it with the same integrity he had sought in his living. He was buried in Tus, near the tomb of the great Persian poet Ferdowsi. The two men represented different dimensions of Persian culture: the poet who had celebrated the pre-Islamic heroes of Persia, and the scholar who had dedicated his life to Islam. That they lie near each other suggests something about the synthesis that characterized Persian Islamic civilization, in which ancient heritage and new faith combined to create something distinctive. Al-Ghazali left behind a body of work that would be read for centuries. The revival of the religious sciences became the most influential book in the Islamic tradition after the Quran itself. The Incoherence of the Philosophers shaped debates about the relationship between faith and reason for generations. The Deliverance from Error became a classic of spiritual autobiography, inspiring countless readers who recognized their own struggles in his account. His shorter works continued to circulate, be copied, be studied, and be commented upon across the Islamic world. His influence was not only through his writings. He had trained students who became teachers themselves, passing on not only his ideas, but something of his spiritual presence. The Sufi communities he had helped establish continued, developing their own traditions while preserving his memory. The integration of Sufism into mainstream Islamic orthodoxy, which his work had done so much to accomplish, became the norm across most of the Sunni world. The transformation that Al-Ghazali underwent during his years of wandering was not unique to him. The Sufi tradition was full of stories of seekers who had left everything to pursue the path. But Al-Ghazali was unique in combining this transformation with extraordinary intellectual power and the ability to articulate what he had experienced. He could not only travel the path, but map it for others. He could not only taste the truth, but describe its flavor in language that others could understand. This combination made him the great bridge between the scholars and the saints, the jurists and the mystics, the outer and the inner dimensions of Islam. His death did not end his influence, but transformed it. A living teacher can respond to questions, adapt teachings to circumstances, correct misunderstandings. A dead teacher is known only through texts, which must be interpreted by readers who may or may not understand them rightly. Al-Ghazali's reputation grew after his death, until he became known as the Proof of Islam, the Renewer of Religion, a title that expressed the reverence in which he was held. Whether he would have been comfortable with such exalted titles is uncertain. He had struggled so hard against pride. But the titles testified to the impact of his work on those who came after him. Within the Islamic world, Al-Ghazali's most immediate impact was on the relationship between Sufism and mainstream religious life. Before him, there had been tension between the mystics and the scholars of law and theology. The Sufis spoke of direct experience of God, of states of consciousness beyond ordinary awareness, of love that dissolved the boundary between lover and beloved. The legal scholars emphasized obedience to divine commands, the careful observance of rules, the proper ordering of social life. These emphases could seem opposed. Was the goal law-abiding behavior or mystical union? Was God the lawgiver to be obeyed or the beloved to be sought? Al-Ghazali bridged this gap. He insisted that law and mysticism were not alternatives, but complementary dimensions of a single path. The law provided the outer framework within which the inner transformation could occur. The mystical path provided the inner purpose that gave meaning to legal observance. To practice law without mysticism was to have a body without a soul, mere external compliance without interior transformation. To pursue mysticism without law was to seek spiritual heights without a proper foundation, to risk the kind of antinomian excess that had brought some Sufis into disrepute. This synthesis became the dominant understanding in the Sunni Islamic world. The revival of the religious sciences was its charter, providing detailed guidance for integrating outer observance with inner transformation. Sufi orders, which proliferated after Al-Ghazali's time, typically accepted the legal framework of one of the established schools while adding their own distinctive spiritual disciplines. This was the pattern Al-Ghazali had exemplified: a Shafi'i in law, an Ash'ari in theology, a Sufi in spiritual practice. The combination was not a contradiction but a fullness. The impact on philosophy was more ambiguous and remains hotly debated. Al-Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers was the most powerful attack on the philosophical tradition that the Islamic world had seen. It charged the philosophers with unbelief on specific points and argued more generally that their claims to demonstrative certainty were unfounded. In the centuries after Al-Ghazali, philosophical activity in the Islamic heartlands declined, and some historians have blamed him for this decline, calling him the man who killed Islamic philosophy. This interpretation has been challenged. The decline of philosophy had multiple causes: political instability, the disruptions of the Mongol invasions, shifts in patronage, the rise of legal studies as the dominant intellectual activity. Al-Ghazali may have contributed to these trends, but he did not single-handedly cause them. Furthermore, his critique was not of reason as such, but of the pretensions of a particular philosophical tradition. He valued logic and employed it brilliantly in his own work. He did not think reason was useless, only that it was limited. Moreover, philosophical activity did not cease entirely. The great response to Al-Ghazali, Averroes's Incoherence of the Incoherence, was written in the Western Islamic world a century later. In the Eastern Islamic world, a tradition of philosophical theology continued, integrating elements of Avicennan philosophy with Ash'ari theology. In Persia, a distinctive philosophical tradition developed that engaged with Al-Ghazali's work while going beyond it. The story is more complicated than a simple narrative of decline would suggest. Al-Ghazali's influence reached beyond the Islamic world through the medium of translation. His works were translated into Latin in medieval Europe, where Christian scholars were wrestling with similar questions about the relationship between faith and reason. Thomas Aquinas knew Al-Ghazali's arguments, referred to him by the Latin name Al-Ghazal, and responded to some of his positions. The critique of causality had particular resonance. Aquinas defended the reality of natural causation against the occasionalist alternative. Jewish thinkers also engaged with Al-Ghazali. Moses Maimonides, the greatest medieval Jewish philosopher, read him carefully. Maimonides' own relationship to the philosophical tradition was complex. He was a defender of Aristotelian philosophy in some respects, while recognizing its limits in others. His engagement with Al-Ghazali helped shape his positions on issues like the relationship between reason and revelation, the nature of divine knowledge, and the possibility of natural theology. The anticipation of later Western philosophy has intrigued modern scholars. Al-Ghazali's argument that we observe only sequence, not necessary connection, and that what seems like causation might be merely constant conjunction, resembles the arguments David Hume would make 6 centuries later. Whether Hume knew Al-Ghazali's work, directly or indirectly, remains uncertain. But the similarity is striking and suggests that these are perennial problems that different thinkers in different traditions independently discover. Similarly, Al-Ghazali's wager argument, his suggestion that even if the promises of religion cannot be proven, the prudent person will live as if they were true because the potential gain vastly outweighs the potential loss, anticipates the famous wager of Blaise Pascal. The French mathematician and philosopher, writing in the 17th century, argued that if God exists and one believes, one gains everything. If God does not exist and one believes, one loses little. But if God exists and one does not believe, one loses everything. Therefore, rational self-interest counsels belief, even in the absence of proof. Al-Ghazali had made a similar argument centuries earlier. In the context of addressing those who doubted the reality of the afterlife, he suggested that the wise person should act as if the warnings of the prophets were true. If they are true and you have heeded them, you are saved. If they are false and you have heeded them, you have lost nothing of ultimate importance. But if they are true and you have ignored them, you face disaster. The expected value calculation favors belief, and the conduct that follows from belief. Whether Pascal knew Al-Ghazali's work, directly or indirectly, remains uncertain. But the structural similarity is notable. Both thinkers recognize that existential decisions must sometimes be made without demonstrative proof, and both argued that reason itself recommends the choice that faith would endorse. This convergence suggests that these problems are not merely cultural artifacts, but reflect something deep in the human situation. Al-Ghazali's influence on Jewish philosophy has also been significant. Moses Maimonides, the greatest medieval Jewish philosopher, read Al-Ghazali carefully and engaged with his arguments. Maimonides' own relationship to the philosophical tradition was complex. He was a defender of Aristotelian philosophy in some respects while recognizing its limits in others. His famous work, The Guide for the Perplexed addresses many of the same questions that Al-Ghazali had raised. The relationship between reason and revelation, the nature of divine knowledge, the possibility of natural theology. The engagement with Al-Ghazali helped shape Maimonides' positions, even where he disagreed. In the modern period, Al-Ghazali's legacy has been claimed by various parties. Islamic reformers have invoked him as a model for renewing religious life in the face of stagnation and decline. His emphasis on interior transformation rather than mere external conformity appeals to those who see contemporary Muslim practice as overly formalistic. His critique of scholars who pursue learning for its own sake rather than for spiritual growth resonates with critics of contemporary academia. At the same time, Al-Ghazali has been blamed for what his critics see as the anti-intellectualism of much Muslim thought. His attack on philosophy, they argue, discouraged the rational inquiry that the Islamic world needed for continued intellectual progress. His emphasis on tradition and authority over independent investigation contributed to a conservatism that stifled creativity. His success in integrating Sufism into mainstream Islam spread mystical attitudes that were hostile to empirical science. These debates are unlikely to be resolved because they involve larger questions about the direction Islamic civilization should take. Those who think the Islamic world needs more rationalism will tend to view Al-Ghazali negatively. Those who think it needs more spirituality will view him positively. He has become a symbol in a larger argument, and the symbol has sometimes obscured the man. What can be said without controversy is that Al-Ghazali was one of the most influential thinkers in Islamic history. His works continue to be read, studied, and debated. His synthesis of law, theology, and mysticism remains the dominant framework within Sunni Islam. His questions about certainty, the limits of reason, and the possibility of direct experience of truth remain live questions that every thoughtful person must confront. Whether one agrees with his answers or not, the questions themselves are inescapable. Al-Ghazali's own life demonstrated this truth. He achieved everything that the world he lived in could offer: the most prestigious position, the highest reputation, the patronage of the powerful, the admiration of thousands. And he found that it was not enough. The success that others envied revealed itself as empty. The knowledge that had made him famous felt hollow. The arguments that had defeated opponents could not defeat the doubt that attacked his own foundations. At the peak of his worldly achievement, he discovered that worldly achievement was not what he truly sought. What he truly sought was certainty, not the certainty that comes from winning arguments, but the certainty that comes from seeing truth directly. He sought knowledge that was not merely about God, but of God, not merely describing the divine, but encountering it. He sought transformation, not just of his beliefs, but of his entire being, so that he would become the kind of person who could perceive what his ordinary self could not perceive. This seeking drove him to abandon everything and wander for 11 years, practicing disciplines that promised what he sought, but could not guarantee it. And he found what he sought. The accounts he left do not describe the experience in detail. Perhaps it cannot be adequately described, but they make clear that something happened, that the certainty he had sought was granted, that the knowledge he had longed for came to him. He was not the same person afterward. The learning remained, the intellectual power, the capacity for argument. But now these were grounded in something deeper, an experiential foundation that gave weight to everything else. The message he brought back from his journey was both simple and demanding. The path to God is through the heart, and the heart must be purified before it can see. The diseases that corrupt the heart, pride, envy, anger, greed, love of the world, all these must be diagnosed and treated. The practices that purify, prayer, fasting, remembrance, self-examination, all these must be undertaken seriously and persistently. The transformation is not instant. It unfolds over years, perhaps over a lifetime, but it is possible. The great saints have demonstrated that it is possible, and for those who undertake it, everything changes. This message has not lost its relevance. The world has changed dramatically since the 11th century. The empires Al-Ghazali knew have dissolved. The cities he visited have been rebuilt many times. The technologies that shape daily life would be unrecognizable to him, but the fundamental human situation remains the same. People still seek what cannot satisfy. They still pursue success that turns out to be empty. They still accumulate knowledge that does not transform them. They still hunger for something they cannot name. Al-Ghazali's diagnosis of this situation is as penetrating now as it was 9 centuries ago. The problem is not a shortage of information. Modern people have access to more information than any previous generation. The problem is not a lack of technique. Modern science and technology can do things that medieval people would have considered magical. The problem is in the heart, in the fundamental orientation of desire, in the assumptions about what matters and what makes life worth living. Information cannot change this. Technique cannot fix it. What is needed is transformation. The spiritual path Al-Ghazali described is not the only path that has been proposed for such transformation. Other religions, other philosophies, other therapeutic approaches offer their own methods and their own promises. Whether Al-Ghazali's path is the best path or even a valid path is a question each seeker must answer for herself. But the problem to which he offered his path remains. The hunger remains. The dissatisfaction with worldly success remains. The sense that there must be something more remains. These are permanent features of the human condition, and they ensure that Al-Ghazali will continue to be read as long as human beings continue to seek. For those who do read him, the encounter can be transformative. His prose is clear without being simplistic, learned without being pedantic, demanding without being inaccessible. He writes as one who has travelled the path he describes, not as an outsider reporting what others have said. This experiential authority gives his words a weight that purely theoretical discussions lack. One senses that he knows what he is talking about, that he has paid the price of knowledge in his own life, that his guidance can be trusted. The trust is not blind. Al-Ghazali does not ask readers to accept his conclusions on authority. He presents arguments, provides evidence, appeals to reason. But he also points beyond what reason can establish, to experiences that reason can neither produce nor evaluate. At some point, the seeker must move from reading about the path to walking it, from understanding descriptions of the goal to actually pursuing it. Al-Ghazali can help with the first stages of this journey. He can clear away misconceptions, provide orientation, describe what others have found, but he cannot walk the path for anyone else. Each person must walk it for herself. The heart that Al-Ghazali described, the spiritual center of the human being, remains mysterious. Modern psychology has different categories, speaks of consciousness and unconsciousness, of cognitive processes and emotional states, of behavior and its conditioning. These categories are useful for certain purposes, but they do not capture what Al-Ghazali meant by the heart. He was pointing to something that contemporary frameworks tend to miss: the place in us where our deepest knowing and willing occur, the place that orients us toward whatever we truly love, the place that can be healthy or sick, clear or clouded, turned toward God or turned away. This heart is not directly observable. We cannot see it the way we see physical objects. We cannot measure it the way we measure brain activity, but we can become aware of it through attention, through reflection, through the practices that Al-Ghazali recommended. And when we become aware of it, we discover that it is indeed the center, the place from which everything else proceeds, the hidden root of all our visible activities. The purification of this heart is the work of a lifetime. Al-Ghazali did not claim that the work can be completed quickly or easily. The diseases that corrupt the heart are deeply rooted, intertwined with everything else we are, resistant to treatment. Pride especially is stubborn. We can work on it for years and still find new forms of it arising. Envy, anger, greed, attachment to the world. These too have roots that go deep and keep growing back. The work is never finished in the sense of being done once and for all, but it can make progress. The heart can become clearer, the clouds can thin, the light can grow stronger. For those who make this progress, the reward is what Al-Ghazali found: certainty. Not the certainty of intellectual proof, which can always be challenged, but the certainty of direct experience, which is its own confirmation. The one who has tasted honey does not need arguments that honey is sweet. The one who has seen light does not need proofs that there is light to see. This experiential certainty is available, Al-Ghazali testified. It is what the great Sufis have found. It is what he himself found. And it is what every sincere seeker can hope for. The story that began with a scholar who could not speak ends with a message that continues to speak across centuries. Al-Ghazali found his voice again, a voice rooted not in learning alone but in transformation. He spoke from the heart to the heart. He addressed the hunger that no worldly food can satisfy. He pointed to a path that he had travelled and that others could travel. And his words remain, waiting for those who are ready to hear them, inviting those who have ears to hear. The scholar who walked away returned as a guide. The mind that dismantled the philosopher's pretensions became a heart that pointed beyond all pretensions to what is real. The crisis that seemed like destruction was actually the breaking open of something that needed to break. And the man who thought he knew everything discovered that true knowledge was just beginning. This is the legacy of Al-Ghazali. Not answers that end inquiry, but an invitation that opens it. Not conclusions that close discussion, but questions that deepen it. Not a system to be memorized, but a path to be walked. The heart that sought and found remains an inspiration to hearts that are still seeking. And the certainty he achieved remains a promise to those who are willing to pay the price.